Hello, listeners. I have my dear friend and fan favorite back on the show today. Welcome, Dr. Chris Pachel.
Hello, Marissa. Thanks for having me back. I look forward to these conversations every time I see them pop up on my calendar, and I'm thinking, yay, this is going to be amazing. Thanks for having me.
Of course. So, Chris and I will be talking about a meaty topic, which is the humane hierarchy. And we're going to talk about it first through a canine example, right? Because that's what we do, dog behavior consulting. And then we're going to talk about it and how we can use it as a framework for interacting with people. And since I love listening to Chris explain these concepts, I knew he'd be the perfect guest for the show. I've heard him talk about the humane hierarchy and like things in my brain just click and like light bulbs go off. And yeah, so I had to have him come on. And especially since he's a co-founder of LIMA Beings with me. And this is the stuff that we talk about in our monthly membership all the time. So Chris, as I said, no pressure. You're so articulate and talking about the humane hierarchy. Well, you're articulate and talking about most things. But let's dive in and define what that is, and possibly provide maybe an everyday common example for each step of the way. That would be probably really helpful to set the stage for our listeners.
Fabulous. No, and this is going to be a fun conversation. And as you said, with the lead out that this is something that's meaty, I think is a really accurate way to look at this. And I would like, hopefully, as we go through this conversation, to make it really accessible to start out. And we can get sort of layers deeper into it as we go there. But, really just to set the stage, it's a framework that was really developed, popularized, put into the community by Dr. Susan Friedman, who is just a brilliant, brilliant creator and force to be reckoned with within our industry, right? And so we've got this hierarchy of behavior change procedures that starts out from the most positive, least intrusive, and looking at that as a way of not mandating, but guiding the way that we approach behavior change solutions, right? So, and that's it's a little bit jargony, even as I say that out loud, right? There's a lot of sort of technical stuff mixed up within that. But from a framework standpoint, I just want to emphasize a couple of individual words. When we say least intrusive, minimally aversive, that's the LIMA framework, LIMA. And that really is a way of guiding, again, our way of thinking about, hey, guess what? I've identified a behavior in this animal learner, and being intentional about it could be a dog, it could be a cat, it could be a spouse, it could be a child. I've identified something within this animal learner that I would like to see different, right? Whether we're talking, typically talking operant behaviors, but potentially on the emotional side as well. And so this is a way to guide, again, that framework of how we approach it. And for those of you who are new to this concept, there is a visual graphic that really looks at this as if we're on a highway of behavior change, right? So we got this little yellow car cruising down the roadway. And when we say on our road trip, guess what? I've got an animal in front of me that I want to impact their behavior in a particular direction. Where do I start? What's the first exit off of this highway? And so exit number one here is what's described as wellness. Really thinking about the nutritional needs, the physical needs of that learner. And then we're going to go on to the additional exits after that. But starting out, understanding that exit number one is the physical wellness of the individual is such a critically important place to start. Now, I'm going to list all steps here. I find myself wanting to kind of go into a bit more of an organizational framework here right from the get-go for those people who are listening but may not have the visual up in front of them. So exit number one is going to be the wellness piece that I just mentioned. Exit number two is going to be antecedent arrangements. Number three is positive reinforcement. Exit four is differential reinforcement of alternative behaviors. And then exit five is a cluster that includes extinction, negative reinforcement, and negative punishment. And then all the way at the end of this journey, behind multiple speed bumps, a yield sign, and a stop sign with a big old red and white slash, is positive punishment. And we're going to talk about where and when and why we might think about that as well, but just really thinking about the order in which these are presented. Before I go on to kind of coming back to the wellness piece and starting to bring this into a real practical, tangible example, are there any other little details that you want me to tease out of that, Marissa, before we move forward?
No, I think that's great.
Awesome. So the example that came to mind is something that I navigate in my own home. For those of you who have met Cornelius through social media, my bull terrier mix, who is now, gosh, he's now oof, 9 years old at this point, and he is, by label, we might call him a quote unquote reactive dog. He has big feelings about a lot of things. He gets excitable very easily. It's not a negative thing, but he can shift gears very, very quickly. And he does struggle with regulating emotional arousal, even in the midst of circumstances where he's had adequate training to quote unquote, where he should be able to perform. Right. So
Mhm.
that's kind of who he is as an individual. The problem that I'm going to emphasize here is his habit of barking at passersby. So if he's out on the deck, specifically in our yard, and someone, specifically someone with a dog, walks by, he's likely to announce that, and he rushes up to the fence line, which is still probably 30 feet back from the actual sidewalk, and he barks. That's the problem that we're going to look at. And so when I think about that particular problem through this lens of the humane hierarchy, it gives me the framework to then say, okay, if I truly want to change that behavior, if it's problematic either for him or for me or for my neighbors, where do I start? That exit number one, starting out with wellness and thinking about nutritional and physical needs is a really important one, especially for me as a veterinarian, right? I want to make sure that my patients, my animals are healthy. Now, of course, we want the best for them, but why does that matter in the context of this particular example? Well, we know that there are certain conditions, allergies for one, chronic osteoarthritis or musculoskeletal pain for another, other conditions related to thyroid levels or perhaps steroid levels within the body. These things create or contribute to agitation, arousal, altered thresholds, decreases or differences in mental processing capacity or impacts on learning. These things matter. It's not just saying, is he healthy? Check the box, but
Mhm.
rather saying, is he actually set up to respond? Versus if he is actually experiencing physical discomfort or any of these other influences, gosh, everything else that I'm going to try to do to change his behavior is going to be that much more challenging if he's not in a physical, emotional, or cognitive place to really respond appropriately. So I want to start by checking that box to the best of our ability, knowing that, gosh, he's 9. I'm not going to turn him into a 2-year-old. So there may still be some details here that I can't fully address, but I'm going to address them to the best of my ability, or at least acknowledge their influence on the behaviors that we're seeing for him. Now, assuming I've done that, and I'm still looking at him saying, okay, I've addressed that to the best of my ability, then I start to move into some of the behavioral interventions. So exit 2 on this highway now is antecedent arrangements. Now, for those of you who might be a little bit newer to some of the terminology here, antecedent is basically referring to those conditions under which a particular behavior occurs. So in this case, we're talking about the behavior of barking at canine passersby that occurs under the antecedent conditions of being outdoors on the patio with that stimulus coming by and so on. So in this exit 2, antecedent arrangements is basically asking the question, can I arrange the environment in such a way that he's simply less likely to engage in that particular behavior? And there's all sorts of reasons why, not only from a safety standpoint, but even acknowledging the impact of rehearsal. Each and every time he goes through those motions, he's essentially deepening the grooves within his brain of what those patterns and what those habits look like. So if my goal is to eventually change behavior, I'm going to try to keep him out of both safety risk territory, but also avoiding practicing of that unwanted behavior. So that might be something as simple as hanging up a visual barrier. It might be a matter of saying, before I let him out into the yard or give him unsupervised free time in the yard, do I scan the environment and make sure that there's not a dog coming down the street? It might be a matter of taking him outside supervised, maybe even having him on a long line, something that gives me a little bit more physical control if I need it, as a way of removing him from that. It might also be in certain cases, if my fence line actually was right up next to the sidewalk, I might even create a bit of a temporary fence,
Mm-hmm.
5, 10, 15 feet back, so that I'm creating a bit of a moat or a Switzerland, if you will, in between the stimulus and where he has the ability to go, knowing that for a lot of dogs, that makes it easier for them to watch the environment without necessarily reacting to it. So the thing to remember about these antecedent arrangements is that they don't really teach anything. And it's not a reinforcement strategy. I'm not actively telling him what to do. I'm simply saying, can I restructure that environment in a way that makes that less likely to happen? Now, if I've changed that environment so that other behaviors are more likely, there may be some learning that's happening along the way simply by practicing alternative behaviors. But again, it's not an active
Mm-hmm.
training approach, at least not yet.
Yeah, I just want to pop in there because I'm so fascinated with how many people I hear from, often several clients, even trainers. They want permission that this is okay to just do this. And I'm like, hell yes, it is, right? Like if you just want to manage it and prevent it from rehearsing and taking place, you absolutely can do that. Just know, like you said, that it is not that, like, if those antecedents are removed or the management strategy is no longer there, or when it fails, because it always does, right? The previous problematic behavior that we were concerned about might and most likely will resurface, right? Because the previous antecedent that's causing that problematic behavior is now present for that dog. So I love that you really tease that out and remind folks that, yeah, just because we're managing it and we don't see the problematic behavior anymore doesn't mean it's still, like, there isn't, it's still a choice for the dog, right? Depending on certain conditions. And hear me loud and clear, full permission to manage certain behaviors, especially when you have a laundry list of problematic behaviors that you're concerned about. Picking and choosing which are highest priority with, by yourself or with your behavior consultant is going to be critical. So I'm so surprised that so many people are, like, feel shame about it, almost like, oh, I'm not doing my part to modify this. And it's like, yes, and you're human, and this can be hard at times.
I love that. And especially in those cases where we may have multiple issues going on, or
Mm-hmm.
maybe we're still really trying to focus on some of those medical issues in exit one. We're
Totally.
working our way through that and we're like, oh, but in the meantime, this is still a really big problem for me. It's disturbing my neighbors. It's annoying me. He's getting himself really worked up. Whatever the consequences of that might be, jumping in and saying, cool, what can we do to manage the problem until we're able to move forward with more long-lasting solutions in
Mm-hmm.
some way. And I love the permission detail that you brought in there, Marissa. I think that's so important. So important. And knowing that some of our clients, as you said, may just stop there and go, yeah, I
Yep.
guess that's actually good enough.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. Amazing.
Yeah.
Our job just got a whole lot easier.
Totally. Ours and theirs, right?
Yeah, no, and I think ours, I think about that. I'm like, yeah, for me, there are those days where I'm like, yep, I'm just gonna manage today. I don't have the spoons to really be thinking
Mm-hmm.
about effective behavior change strategies right now. And that's a big piece too, even when we look at this particular stage within this humane hierarchy. These are not absolute or permanent details. And what I mean by that is that when I'm describing this to my clients, as we move forward into the more active behavior change strategies, we're not training 24/7.
Yep.
No one is. And so this is still going to be an active part of our plan to say, well, when you're training, when you're putting some of these next exits or strategies into play, cool. And then the moment that you're not there to give your animal learner that feedback about the appropriate or the reinforceable options, we're going to go right back into exit two and back into those management strategies so that we always know either I'm preventing the problem behavior from happening or I'm teaching my animal exactly what it is that I want them to do or how I want them to feel under those conditions. So, even in a really involved behavior change program, management or antecedent arrangement is still a very active,
Yep.
ongoing part of this process from beginning to end.
Love it.
So that takes us then to exit three. So we've got our wellness, we've got our antecedent arrangements, and then number three is positive reinforcement. And this is still general. And what I mean by that is this is basically the opportunity to create a learning experience for that animal to say, these are things that I'm willing to reinforce. These are the rewards. These are the things that are meaningful for you. I'm using positive reinforcement or the addition of something that's generally considered pleasurable or enjoyable to the animal as a consequence or an associative learning consequence to that circumstance so that certain behaviors are more likely to occur or more probable in the future. And that's what really defines this as positive reinforcement. So we're seeing strengthening or increase in some measurable way in the desired behavior here, again, typically by leveraging an enjoyable consequence from the animal's perspective. Now, the reason I'm really teasing that out in very general terms is this isn't necessarily even specific to that barking at the fence line problem. This is even just the opportunity to expose Cornelius, in this case, to the world of positive reinforcement to help him understand that this is a dialogue. This is a conversation that he and I are able to have in a way that gives him the sense of having some control over outcomes, i.e., when I do this thing, that leads to something that's really enjoyable for me. Ooh, that's kind of cool, right? So we're creating that learning, even sort of the learning how to learn, learning how to impact your environment in really positive ways, in a way that tends to reduce emotionality, it reduces anxiety, and it sets the foundation for some of the things to come next when we're actually then starting to think about very specific or incompatible behaviors as we get into exit four in just a second. But it's that foundation of really helping the animal to understand what it's all about, to learn through positive reinforcement. And sometimes when I really tease out exit three from exit four, sometimes I think it paints the picture that we're going to have to spend days and weeks and months sort of drilling basic behaviors before we can address the problematic situation like the barking at the fence line. And that's not typically the case. If I'm working with a dog who's relatively naive to the training process and I'm starting to introduce that idea or that concept of positive reinforcement, I can usually get that little first glint of a light bulb to start turning on for that animal learner within a couple of minutes, either through shaping or utilizing perhaps a skill, a basic skill like sit or a hand target, something that they may already know. I can help them to understand that they do have some control over what happens in their environment. So I don't want to give the sense that this is going to take weeks and weeks and months to go through 72 different training courses to get there. It's just turning on that light bulb for the learner to go, cool. I can achieve positive outcomes by doing certain things. That takes us then into exit four, which is the differential reinforcement of alternative behaviors. So that allows me then to look at this Cornelius problem. I keep pointing in this direction for those of you who are watching this, because that's where my fence line is, where Cornelius would be outside. And so that gives us the opportunity to say, well, if I don't want him barking and charging the fence line, what do I want him to do? What would a successful outcome look like here? And so that could be, I would like him to visually track the individual walking by without barking.
Mm-hmm.
That might be an outcome. It might be a matter of turning that stimulus into a cue, meaning when you notice a dog, if you come flying at me as fast as you can, I'm going to reward you with a food scatter in the kitchen. That might be the outcome. For somebody else, it might be something completely different. Some people may say, I actually want to know that there's a dog outside. So you may want that dog to bark once and then come and find you. Again, there's a lot of different options. There's no one way to say this is what success looks like. But this is the point where we're then saying, ooh, I'm going to start differentially reinforcing rather than just reinforcing all the behaviors I like. I'm actually starting to teach you that under these specific conditions, if you do this, that's where you're going to achieve the maximal reinforcement. That's what we're rehearsing. That's what we're practicing. And that's where we start to get into this idea that, the animal is now making an active choice rather than seeing a dog walking by and barking, charging forward. I can choose a different option as a way to receive or create a reinforcement opportunity. And that's really where that level of choice comes in. Before we go on to level 5, to exit 5, I want to mention that for those of you who are looking at the visual, you'll notice there's a little speed bump in between exit 3 and exit 4. That even by the time we get through that basic foundation of positive reinforcement and we're moving on to differential reinforcement of alternative behaviors, there's already a little bit of a speed bump indicating that we, as the behavior change coach or whoever we are in that role, should actually slow down a little bit. The reason for that, or at least the way that I think about that, is that as we move our way through this behavior change hierarchy and moving our way down this highway, the further we get down the highway, the greater the likelihood of there being, coercion or some degree of us saying, I am now layering my goals, I'm layering my objectives on top of your needs as an autonomous individual. And so this is where that least intrusive piece of the LI comes into play, is that when we were talking about just making sure you're healthy, that's not terribly intrusive in most cases. Antecedent arrangement, generally minimally intrusive. But as we start to move further and further along, and we're now saying, no, don't do this instead, the likelihood or the possibility of that to come across to the animal learner as social pressure, environmental pressure, learning pressure, something along those lines starts to climb a bit. Doesn't mean we can't do it, doesn't mean we shouldn't do it, but slow down. This is the point to be a bit more intentional about really asking those questions. Again, what do I want the animal to do? How do I want them to feel? Am I setting them up to actively, effectively learn that in the fewest number of repetitions possible? Did I actually do a good job with the exits 1, 2, and 3, or did I blow past them faster than my trainer or behavior consultant told me I should? Where are we at? Right? So it's that slow down piece that I think often gets missed. And we'll come back to whether we ever skip some of these first exits in certain cases, yes or no. But that's kind of where I really think about that transition from exit 3 to exit 4.
Yeah. So then if I'm hearing this correctly, right? So if I'm thinking about exit 3 with positive reinforcement, let's say I'm working with Cornelius and he looks at me and I'm marking him and reinforcing him for any time he orients to me, right? We're in a low distraction environment. There is no stressful trigger, right? So I'm just teaching him that anytime he orients to me, because that's the final desired behavior in the place in the moment when the stressor appears. Let's say that that's what we chose. So I'm going to be marking and reinforcing any offered orientation to me, and then placing my food on the ground so that he's ultimately going to lift his head up to look at me again after he eats. So I'm going to mark and reinforce again, and we're going to have this loop. So that would be positive reinforcement, where I am teaching him that when he orients to me, the likelihood of him getting a consequence that is positive or repetitive to him is going to continue. So then the DRA procedure, right, and this is where that there's a speed bump, right? Because now we're going to start to maybe move that same game out into the backyard. Maybe there's not a dog walking by, right? But this is how we sort of like layer in those distractions, which you're right. There is environmental pressure. There is social pressure. There's learning pressure, right? Because now I'm like, no, I need you to orient to me. There's things around, but I need you to orient to me. And that's where it becomes a little bit more intrusive, right? Because again, that is my agenda, right? So the DRA procedure is really for folks that are familiar with like layering in distractions and, trying to work under threshold, but always pushing a little bit, because ultimately if we don't push a little bit, we don't wind up moving towards our goal, which again, that's that pressure that the animal might feel. That's how I think about it. Am I thinking about it correctly?
I love the way you just reframed that, Marissa, too, because it sort of pulls in that additional terminology of desensitization, right? Or thinking about a
Mm-hmm.
stimulus gradient. People go, well, where does that fit within the humane hierarchy? And you just nailed exactly where that is. That's the point at which we say, cool, I've got affluent behavior that would be desirable under these high intensity or more challenging conditions. And now I'm going to gradually um, as quickly as the animal learner allows us to. It might
Mm-hmm.
happen all the way in an afternoon. It might take weeks or months, depending on the individual learner. But as they're able to be successful in performing that behavior with progressively more distracting environments, or again, whatever the difficulty level is for that particular animal, that's the desensitization portion here. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that's a really important detail, is that, we often have clients, and even myself sometimes, I struggle because I may have been really working on that positive reinforcement piece of exit 3, and I've got a dog who's super fluent about offering that attention. And we've got this beautiful training loop, and we've got 47 reps in a row if that's what we are aiming for. And then we change up the environment. We move them
Yep.
into a new environment, and we get really frustrated as the teachers. You know this. We
Mm.
just practiced it. You know this. Why are
Yep.
you struggling? Or we may push or assume that just because they were able to do it in a non distracting, easy environment, that they're automatically going to generalize that learning over to the actual problematic situation. And I think what we often forget is that that particular problematic situation, in Cornelius's case with the reaction to other dogs, he has learning history
Yep.
reacting to the dog. So that's still within his repertoire. So I'm basically asking him to opt in for a new way of achieving reinforcement. But he didn't forget that old one. It's still in there. And so if he is stressed, if he is, again, physically uncomfortable, if it's a really, really loud dog that's going by, that's going to make it more challenging for him to access that new skill. And again, that's where the desensitization process, or that stimulus gradient, really comes into play. And we, as the educators, and whether that's the educator of the client or the pet owner or the caregiver, or whether it's the education of the animal learner itself, that's the place where we have to, again, be a bit patient and ask ourselves the question, did we give that animal learner enough feedback that they're likely to be successful in the level of difficulty that we're presenting to them? And if not, if we accidentally overshoot our goal and we have a dog who makes the wrong choice, at this stage, working in exit 4, it's not a big deal, right? It's not something where we automatically say, oh, you screwed up, and so here's all the big consequences. If we're really working up to exit 4, it's really just about saying, I'm going to reinforce you when you do it right, reinforce you when you do it right. You made an error. Cool. Let me drop back the difficulty a little bit and see if I can reinforce you again for doing it right. So I'm strengthening, I'm creating that fluency of behavior as we're increasing difficulty. And again, I think that's something that often gets overlooked when we expect too much too soon of our learners.
Yeah. And I think what's how you just said that, you're like, okay, we pushed, that wasn't an ideal outcome when I pushed. So we're going to just step back and we're going to get back into that reinforcement loop. I want everyone to hear that, because gosh, like when we push, and I have been like, there are days where I'm like, Marissa, you are pushy. Like you have to be aware of that, right? Like you're being pushy, take a step back, right? But there are times where when we push or when we have a negative outcome, that like I have seen clients just spiral. It's like, oh, like it's just, I know it can be really hard, especially when we're trying to prevent it, when we're trying to prevent problematic behavior. But I also think it's especially hard. And I can resonate with this, a concept for human relationships, when you're doing so well. And then you have that moment of like, quote unquote, regression. It's just information, right? Like I have a mantra right now where it's like, regression is a gift. regression is instead of, I don't even want to call it regression anymore because it's such a like negative word, but it's just information that like, and it's up to us to really be self-aware enough to be like, ooh, having this moment, I'm not going to go down a shame spiral. I am going to just take this as information. And then how do I how do I modify my training session? Right. I still need work around that. I can't imagine how some of our clients must feel.
Yes. And, I think whether, if we are in the role of the trainer, the behavior consultant, the behavioral veterinarian, whatever our role is, we put a lot of pressure under ourselves to achieve those outcomes, right? Our
Mm-hmm.
measure of success as a professional is
Oh my gosh.
hinged on whether or not that animal, quote unquote, does it right. And if we're the owner, the outcome may actually be a really big deal. Like, even though I'm sort of trivializing this reaction of Cornelius barking at the fence line, if that was actually jeopardizing my ability to stay in a rental property because of a noise disturbance,
Totally.
or if my neighbor has already expressed a level of concern because his bark is waking up their baby every time it happens, or maybe another neighbor has expressed a feeling of being unsafe because of the timbre of Cornelius's voice. Like, there's a lot of emotional weight that I'm carrying, that I have to
Totally.
fix this. I have to get it done. I don't have time. I need to do this. And when we get that level of urgency, it can really make it increasingly challenging to ask those sort of thoughtful cognitive questions of, did
Mm-hmm.
I set my reinforcers appropriately? Did I give enough repetitions to create behavioral fluency within a training loop? And oh my God, none of that terminology is accessible to us when we're operating from that emotional part of our brain, or I should say it's less accessible. It's not that it's not there, it's just harder to access. So I really want to give that, as much as we can, that grace to not only our canine learners or any other species that we're working with, but their direct educators, as well as the educators of the learner. It's hard at all of these stages,
Mm-hmm.
and we haven't even gotten really to the aversive stuff yet, right? Thinking about this hierarchy of
Yeah.
behavior change, we haven't even hit the second speed bump yet.
Yep.
So that takes us back to then exit 4, which actually has a yield sign associated with it. And that's where we get into extinction, or a
Wait,
simply
exit five. Sorry, I
exit
just
5.
wait,
Yes,
start over and start with exit five.
perfect.
I just didn't want
So
people to
as
get confused. Sorry.
so as we move on from then exit 4, where we're thinking about that DRA, or that differential reinforcement of alternative behaviors, and then we move on to exit 5, now we've got not only another speed bump, but also a yield sign. And now under exit 5, that's where we have extinction, negative reinforcement, and negative punishment. Now, we can spend some time unpacking and getting into
Mm-hmm.
actually what that means, and we probably need to at least a little bit. But the idea here, just clustering them all together for just a second, is these are the things that may be perceived by the learner as being somewhat aversive. So we're manipulating things that may be a little bit less pleasant. We're maybe not adding in those aversives quite yet as a consequence, but we're either taking away something enjoyable, or we're taking away something that was aversive to them, as a way of manipulating that little bit of, ooh, I don't love this outcome, or I didn't love my starting place, and so I'm going to work to make that negative thing go away. Right? We're playing with some ickies, for
Mm-hmm.
lack of a better terminology here. We're playing with some icky stuff, and that can land really, well, unpleasantly to the individual learner. And that's why it comes behind that yield and behind the additional speed bump, is because that's as we're starting to go from the least intrusive, minimally aversive. We're now kind of beyond the minimally aversive piece. We're now at a place where the potential for fallout or unintended consequences of playing with some of those icky physical or emotional feelings starts to really creep up a bit. And I tell myself this, even as someone who's been, gosh, in this industry for 20 years now, and as a board certified veterinary behaviorist for 12, and I got a heck of a lot of experience setting up these behavior change programs. aren't I good enough that I can just utilize these tools and not have some of those unintended consequences? If I'm a good enough trainer, if I'm a good enough owner, can't I avoid all of those potential outcomes and leverage some of these ickies as a way of changing behavior? And the answer is no.
Mm-hmm.
They're there whether we want them to be there or not. That's the baggage or the weight that goes along with leveraging some of these tools. And again, I want to be clear, I'm not saying that we never use them. I'm not saying that they're forbidden or should never be considered. But before we reach for those tools, we really want to be clear with ourselves and with our animal learners. Are they healthy? Did we set up the environment in a way that sets them up to be successful? Do they have fluency of reinforcement-based strategies? Have I taught them what I want them to do under those conditions? If I have a no answer to any of those questions, I should not be manipulating the aversives as a way to create that behavior change for the individual. And for those of you who ever perhaps have been in a circumstance where you've yourselves have been on the receiving end of some of those consequences or some of those situations or experiences, it is not a comfortable way to learn.
No.
And so if I bring this back around to Cornelius on the deck here, and we're thinking about extinction, for example, that would essentially be the equivalent of allowing him to bark it out, basically hoping that he just gets over it. He's going to go through that over and over again. And that may be a really stressful experience for him to experience that over and over again, not to mention that it's probably not going to be terribly effective in this
Yeah.
particular
Yeah.
context. So
Like, no.
not going to do that. Not going to do that. You know, negative reinforcement or negative punishment might be then some of the examples of either applying some sort of pressure. I might be standing right behind him, you know, hovering over him. And the moment he does the right thing, I step back and release the pressure as a way of reinforcing that eye contact, for example. Or perhaps if it was a negative punishment and I was removing him, so I might say, you know what? You want to be outside as a
Yeah.
consequence for barking. I'm going to put you inside almost as a
Time
timeout
out.
procedure. That's kind of where those strategies all live within this example. We're manipulating stuff that may be moderately or significantly unpleasant for the animal, and that's where it lives.
Yeah. I was going to ask a sort of controversial question around timeout, right? I think I'm going to just say in my experience, and people might not love what I say, but in my experience, I just don't think we as behavior consultants, and then especially our clients, the timing of implementing a timeout. Gosh, there feels like so much fallout from that. And there feels like so much like other handling concerns that we could potentially create, whether we're like grabbing the harness or whether we're picking up the puppy or whether we're, dragging the dog back into the house, or just the implementation of that procedure, in my experience, feels really risky. And so I personally don't use that procedure or use timeouts because I'm trying to go steps 1 through 4, at really making sure that I am setting the environment up for that learner. And I'm just like, yeah, I'm not just going to wait for you to do it and then punish you for doing that behavior, and then probably have really poor timing about the implementation of the punishment or the removal of you from the thing that you were enjoying. So yeah, I'm curious to get your perspective on timeouts. Like, I'm sure there are some cases where maybe they're useful, and I'm not a timeout girl, is what I want what I want to say.
No, I generally agree with you. I think I could look at this from an academic standpoint and say, yes, it's absolutely possible for a
Mm-hmm.
learner
Mm-hmm.
to learn by looking at this sort of
Sure.
on paper and say, yes, if you're enjoying the thing that you're doing, but it's a problem for me, And when you do that thing, barking, for example, at the fence line, and I move you inside something that's less enjoyable, yes, it's absolutely possible for me to create an outcome where you decrease your barking so that you get to stay outside, right? I can make an academic case for it, 100%. So does it work? It sure can. Absolutely. And it's tricky, right? It's really hard to get the timing right at the moment where the animal is making the decision to do the unwanted behavior, in this case, Cornelius barking. And unless I'm right there to immediately move him from the fence line to the house, it's going to be hard for me to get the timing correct. And if I have to intervene in any way, either with a recall or even with leash pressure, I'm now creating the potential fallout that you mentioned. I might even be accidentally reinforcing the unwanted behavior because I'm giving it attention by trying to
Mm-hmm.
intervene. And so there's a lot of potential ways where it could go off the rails, so
Yeah.
to speak. Um, and just generally speaking, I don't find it to be either the easiest or the most successful way to teach that particular animal. So I tend to not use them as well. The piece that I want to really clarify, though, is that some people might say, well, gosh, but in the moment, if my dog is out there and I had an oops and this herd of dogs just ran by and now my dog is barking, and if I'm not using a timeout, do I just leave him there at the fence line?
Mm-hmm.
What do I do?
It's my damage control plan. Yeah.
Exactly, exactly. And I tend to think about that as it's almost like the reactive version of exit two, which was our antecedent
Mm-hmm.
arrangements. It's the way of saying, okay, well, antecedent arrangements is really proactive management. We're setting up the environment in a way to prevent that rehearsal. This is sort of the reactive version of that to say, oops, you're flailing, you're not likely to be successful. I may need to, either because of safety or for other reasons, I may need to physically intervene and remove Cornelius to come
Mm-hmm.
inside the house. That may be necessary, and that's fine to do that, again, assuming that it's safe for that intervention to occur. But what I'm not going to do as the trainer, the coach, the consultant, the vet behaviorist, is that I'm not going to expect that reactive
Yep.
management is going to change his future behavior.
Mm-hmm.
That's, I think, a kind of an Achilles heel of this is we think, well, gosh, every time he barks, I call him inside. Why isn't he getting it? It's reactive management.
It's
It's not really a
reactive.
consequence in terms of the way that we're talking about a true negative punishment strategy. So, again, and if this is a new concept for those of you who are listening or watching, I get it. It can kind of be muddy to try to tease out, well, where does this fit versus this fit? And we can debate some of this quite a bit more, actually. But the reality there is, I'm not just advocating for, leaving the dog there to bark, especially if that's creating additional problems. But I'm not going to assume that reactive management is going to change future behavior, just to reemphasize that
Yeah.
point.
It's a great point.
Yeah. So that's all sort of exit five, right? And then we've still got one more exit left, and that's what's considered positive punishment. Now, this one's behind yet another speed bump and a stop sign, right? And that's basically saying this positive punishment, which always sounds a little bit oxymoronic, is the way of saying I'm going to add in a consequence that has the net effect of making a particular behavior less likely or less probable to occur at some point in the future. And that's an important detail. There's a couple of things here. This could be a leash correction. It could be me yelling at Cornelius. It could be me having a shaker can with pennies or rocks in it, some sort of interruptive stimulus or something that he finds aversive or unpleasant. In certain parts of the world, that might be a prong collar or a shock collar or a bark activated device in some way, something that creates an aversive consequence that changes future behavior in the direction of decreasing the probability or likelihood of that. The reason I'm so intentional about the word choices that I'm using there is that there's a big difference, huge difference, in fact, of whether something interrupts the behavior in the moment or whether it changes the future behavior. And the
Mm-hmm.
example here, coming back to Cornelius on the deck outside, is that if Cornelius barks at somebody coming down the street and I say, "Hey," and I get after him. Cornelius, something along those
Mm-hmm.
lines, or I grab for the squirt bottle, or if I've got my finger on a shock collar, which I don't use for him, just by the way, I just want to put that out there as I'm giving these examples. These are not strategies that I routinely use for Cornelius. But if I was reaching for that, that would be the way in which I'm doing that, right? I'm adding in that consequence. And any of those things that are either startling, uncomfortable, distracting, whatever the case may be, they will often interrupt the behavior in the moment, which really allows us as the leverager of that intervention to feel like it's quote unquote successful. It's making a big difference because each and every time I do it, the behavior stops. The question we really need to ask ourselves is, when that situation occurs again in the future, is it less likely to occur and without any unintentional or unwanted side effects of having used that aversive technique? Because what often happens, at least when I'm having this conversation with many of my clients or animal caregivers, is that we often find that those aversive interruptions, if you will, they stop the behavior in the moment, but the next time the situation
Yep.
repeats itself, we're going through this. So it's like a Groundhog's Day, right?
Yep.
And what we need to remember is, from the animal's perspective, then basically what's happening is they are experiencing an unpleasant, uncomfortable, sometimes painful consequence multiple times over
Yep.
and over. It's not actually changing the behavior. And now we actually have a welfare concern, because we are the ones who are adding in that unpleasantness, we're adding in pain, we're adding in discomfort as a consequence, but it's not actually changing behavior. That truly is a welfare concern at that
Yes.
point in time. And
Yes.
that's why that lives all the way at the end of this highway, right? It's risky. It's really risky to reach for it.
Yeah. And it lives at the end of the highway. And it's also encouraged to call, like, phone a friend, right? Be like, okay, hey, I went through all these things and all these steps, and I'm still running it into issues. Most likely, your colleague or, friend, right, that you're talking to about this plan, there is probably going to be changes in the first few steps that you can make before you even have to touch positive punishment, really. So definitely phone a friend is the yield
Such
sign.
a such a great reminder there, because someone who's looking at that, yeah, with a fresh set of eyes or a different perspective or a different toolbox is going to put
Mm-hmm.
some of those other strategies in place. And something that I often hear, and I hear it in my own voice, in my own head as well. Yeah, but if I could give just a really well-timed correction of some sort when that unwanted behavior happens, God, it would be so much easier to just nip it in the bud, so to
Yeah.
speak, to get that. I hear that. My own voice says the same thing. I hear that in my head saying, yeah, that would be a whole lot easier, wouldn't it? And it's not the most effective way to learn. It's not the most effective way to teach. And I really am using the word effective intentionally. It's not just about me sitting on a moral high ground saying, no, 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 we want to do these other things because they're quote unquote nicer. They're actually more effective under most circumstances if we are getting to the point where we're leveraging some form of aversive consequence following this LIMA hierarchy. What we're really trying to do, and again, when I say if, it's because I'm not saying that any of these things are inherently off limit in terms of training tools, but the likelihood of needing them is so low
Mm-hmm.
when you've set the beginning portion of
Yep.
this up for success. And so if there is a case, and this is something that I often tell to my clients, to say, well, if you're asking the question, okay, but when do I get to yell at Cornelius for barking at the dog who's going by? How soon can I grab this squirt bottle? It's like, okay, well, we're not going to start there, right? Let's go through the first steps. If
Mm-hmm.
we get to the point in our behavior change process where we are able to say with confidence, Cornelius is healthy, I've arranged the environment to set him up for success. He understands positive reinforcement. He understands differential positive reinforcement. And I've leveraged whatever I feel is appropriate within exit 5. And I'm still having an animal learner who's choosing the other option. That would be the time where I might consider exit 6. Now, I will tell you that that's the way that I often respond to my clients. So we'll consider that when we get to that point. What I will tell you is, in 20 years of doing this, I think I've gotten to exit 6 3 times.
Mm.
truly getting to exit 6 3 times. And even then, I think if I had phoned a friend or phoned another friend, I probably never even needed to be in exit 6. Right?
Mm-hmm.
I didn't need to be there. It was my own inability to see the other solutions that kind of got me there. And I
Mm-hmm.
say that because I think it's so important for individuals who, either as pet owners, caregivers, shelter staff, trainers, behavior consultants, vet behaviorists, whatever the label is, we all have examples where we've reached for a positive punishment or we've reached for a consequence and it worked. That there's an example where the animal did something, we responded in a particularly dramatic way, and we never saw that behavior ever again. Guess what? I have those examples too. And that's why that voice in my head often says, gosh, couldn't we do that? Wouldn't that be a
Mm-hmm.
whole lot easier if I could just set the animal up to fail or do the problematic thing and just teach them under no certain terms, uncertain terms, is there,
Yeah.
is this the way forward? Yeah, I've got those examples, but when it comes to being a professional or even an owner who's really setting up this plan from the get-go to say, these are the skills, these are the tools that I'm going to be able to leverage here, it's just not the most effective way to go, and it carries with it the greatest amount of risk of now having consequences because, gosh, I have so many soapboxes on this particular topic, that in that circumstance, if something unpleasant happens to the animal, so let's say, going back to Cornelius on the deck, let's say I had made the decision to use a remote activated shock collar or a bark activated shock collar or something along those lines, just to
Mm-hmm.
pick one of those aversive tools. If he reacts to the dog who's walking by and he now experiences physical pain or discomfort, I'm hoping, as the educator, that he associated that aversive thing with the
Yeah.
decision to bark. I don't actually have control over that. So he may, and I'm going to give a couple of examples here, he may have put his paws up on the railing right as he
Yeah.
started barking. And so I may have accidentally associated that aversive consequence with paws up, which could be really problematic if he happens to be a service dog where I need him to put paws up on something to turn on and off the light switch, right? Just as one practical example. It might be something where he stepped onto the grass right as he started
Mm-hmm.
barking. He may decide, you know what, the grass is not worthy of being trusted. I am never going to put my feet on grass ever again. Or it may have been my delightfully sweet neighbor walking along right behind that other dog. And when he saw her, that's when the shock was experienced. And now I've created a conditioned emotional response where he's now afraid or worried about what may happen when he sees my neighbor. I just don't have control over where those associations are likely to be made by the learner, which is one of the reasons why the risk is so great when we're playing, when we're leveraging some of these aversives within these conversations here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you for bringing that up because yeah, you're right. We don't have control over that. And it's funny, whenever I start talking about that with clients, like they're always just like, ooh, yeah, no way. Like it's too risky for them, um, especially when they have dogs that are really social with people. I always say like, wow, your dog is so lovely with people. You've done an amazing job creating really positive experiences. Like, ooh, I wouldn't want to put a like just single event learning is a thing, and like I really wouldn't want to taint all of the experiences your dog has. And they're always like, ooh, yeah, that feels too risky, and they're opting out, right? Not as if I walk in there sharing that like that's one of the tools, but if they ask, like I had a client's dog sitter was part of our training session, and she was like, well, what about the bark sonic collars or whatever? And I was like, like inside I'm like, well, here's why we don't want, and she was like, oh, that makes a ton of sense, and yes, that's very concerning. And so yeah, especially when, I mean, not a great tool really anyway, but especially when we've got a dog that's so social and you're like, gosh, this could ruin, like, we're going to scratch that. I don't want that in there. Okay. So thank you for going through the humane hierarchy. Um, like I said, really meaty topic, right? There's like so many, so many directions that we could go. And I think you're just so articulate and you can explain it in such a way that, again, I'm hoping that folks will really take some aha moments from this conversation, which I'm sure they will. And I love that you walked us through an example of Cornelius, because that's something I'm sure most everyone can relate to in some capacity, like their dog barking, right? It's a dog. And so we had talked about, you and I, just because we love talking about this stuff, that gosh, like the humane hierarchy, I'm using it when I'm working with clients and I'm making behavior change procedures and protocols for my canine learners. Well, what about my human learners, right? Like, how can I utilize this as a framework for them? And so we can use our clients as an example. But what might be some things along each step or along each exit off the highway that we might want to consider if we're looking at these 6 steps?
Oh my gosh. Then this, if we thought that first part of this
I
conversation
know.
was meaty,
I know.
let's dive in here. Let me readjust my chair. Like, okay, let's dive in here. No, it's the same process. I mean, I think that's one of the things that's so fundamental to this approach is understanding that it is in fact it's exactly the same,
Mm-hmm.
right? So let's say that instead of talking about my dog, I'm talking about my fiance, my significant other. His name is Robert. Let's say I'm talking about that and I've got a behavior of his that I would like to change. Let's pick the habit of putting socks into the laundry bin inside out. Let's say
Wait, you
just
want them to be inside out?
no, I would love for them to not be inside out. So let's say, for
Okay.
example, this is a habit that my significant other has, and you could replace it with whatever annoying habit your partner or family member has, or your coworker. Maybe it's putting dirty dishes in the dishwasher. It's who knows what that problem behavior happens to be, right? But the question then becomes if we actually are trying to create a behavior change program around this, even going back to all the way to exit one, well, I'm not, this is that wellness exit, right? The
Mm-hmm.
nutritional and physical piece. I'm not going to say, okay, I need to take you to your doctor for a checkup to make sure you're physically healthy before I have this conversation with you. But I can still recognize that if Robert were to come home from work today and he says, man, I'm just not feeling it. I'm exhausted. I got a headache. It was a really
Yep.
rough day in surgery. Guess what? I'm not checking off the box to say you are at the top of your game and ready to dive into potentially a more challenging conversation, right? So we can still recognize the impact of that physical space on the likelihood of that behavior change going well, right? I could also then say exit two, antecedent arrangements. How might I arrange those environments? So it might even be a matter of saying, gosh, every time I'm home and he comes home for a run and he's ready to take his socks off, I might even be standing there and say, hey, hand me your socks. Like, could you do this for me? Can I arrange that? I know it's a weird example. I know it's the one that popped into my head first. It's going to get weird by the time we get up to positive punishment. But uh, But what could I do that actually makes it more or less likely? Again, I'm not changing. I'm not training him in any way. I'm just decreasing. I might even say, cool, we're not going to wear socks anymore, or I'm changing. This is getting really weird. Okay.
Wait,
Um,
no. Wait, do you want to keep it in or do you want to?
so it's going to get. I didn't think about this perfectly. This example before we started to dive down
Oh, it's okay.
the
Um, because I think what I was thinking of more general stuff, right? Like I was just going
Gotcha.
to
That'd be
share.
easier.
Yeah, I think like because it's like, oh, a behavior change program for my partner. You know what I mean? So
Yeah.
yeah, so let's.
Yeah, if you want to do the intro on that one, and then I am going to have to scoot pretty quickly, so we'll have to make this actually a little bit on the shorter side.
Yeah,
Um,
that's fine.
yeah, yeah. But if we are able to do that, if you do the intro on that, kind of repeating that, how do we transition this over
Okay.
to people, and then keeping it more general, that would be amazing. And I promise I will not lead us down the behavior change highway again, because that was going to get weird thinking about my agenda versus your agenda and blah blah
Yeah,
blah.
yeah, yeah,
So.
yeah. Okay. So now that we have a foundational understanding, again, even though that topic is very meaty of the humane hierarchy, we wanted to just utilize it or look at that framework as a way to engage with our clients, friends, and colleagues. So, and again, we talk about this content all the time. And so we thought it might be fun to maybe talk about a few examples of that might fall under each of the steps within the hierarchy. So you want to kick us off?
Yeah, absolutely. So, thinking about the learners around us, one of the big differences here might be that when I'm thinking about this for a dog, I'm often thinking, cool, I'm your caregiver, I'm your handler, I'm creating a behavior change
Mm-hmm.
program. I don't generally do that same thing for my partner, for my kids, for my coworkers, for my staff, for my boss. I'm not coming at it from exactly that same
Yep.
perspective. But by the same token, the same influences may affect how the learner is going to respond to whatever's happening in their environment. So even thinking about, I'm going to say, maybe I'm even the learner in this example, and I'm just not feeling it today. I'm a little tired. I've got a headache. I'm sore from a good workout yesterday. I'm not well. I'm probably not going to be at the top of my game. And if somebody comes forward and asks me to do something different or gives me some feedback that's a little harder to hear, gosh, that may negatively impact the likelihood of that conversation going well. And so I might even just say, hey, can we have this conversation tomorrow when I'm feeling up to it? So that's
Mm-hmm.
even just right at that first sort of wellness piece and seeing the influence that may have on the way in which I or someone else around me learns.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then the next one would be antecedent arrangement. And I have a lot of examples that, with this particular one, for my partner and I. And so, one is, so if we are out to dinner, this used to be like an old problem of ours, and we've modified our behavior, which is great. It was a successful antecedent arrangement, but we are allowed to only have 1.5 cocktails. So he orders a cocktail, I order a cocktail, and then we order one if we do to share. But anything beyond that, there might be a little bit of an argument, or like the conversation moves into a place where we're like, that doesn't feel really good. So our antecedent arrangement strategy that we consciously talked about, and we have stuck to it, which again modified the behavior, is 1.5 cocktails, right? And we have a joke, we talk about it all the time, but it's really being able to say like, wow, I have a really hard time receiving information with someone via text, so I'm actually going to hop on the phone and call them so that I can really understand what it is that they're trying to say to me, and I might not misinterpret things via text, and I have the capability of asking additional questions, right? Like that's an antecedent arrangement, right? Instead of just having a conversation with somebody via text, I'm going to change how we're having the conversation if that person's willing to opt into the phone call and be able to get my needs met, and then see if that also helps that other person get their needs met. So just a few examples of how can I modify the environment. Or even if I'm working with a client, it's like, wow, I'm noticing that the client's really struggling to do the new procedure, or their treat delivery is really sloppy right now, so we're going to actually move this to the backyard where there's less things for them to have to scan and keep track of in the environment. We're going to move to the backyard or even inside so that their skills can get, their behavior can be modified so that we are rehearsing something that's appropriate. And then we can start to layer in harder scenarios. So just given a few different examples of antecedent arrangement, it's something that I use all the time, right? It's like my floss is out always, right? My like foam roller is sitting next to my bed, right? So it's prompting me to engage in specific behaviors that I'm trying to increase the frequency of. So
Amazing. Amazing. I love the detailed practicality of each of those examples, Marissa. And just really trying to set up the environment in a way to make those behaviors more likely to occur, more or less likely to occur, depending on the circumstance that we're talking about. I love that. And again, all of that can happen before we get to positive reinforcement, which is
mhm.
next. And if we think about, our human learners, we all have different reinforcers, right? And they may even change for us the way that they do for our canine or animal learners as well. And so it may be someone who says, "Oh yeah, no, I really love money. Just,
Mhm.
Venmo me, and that's the best reinforcer that I'm ever going to have." amazing, right? For some people, it's gratitude, right? Where it's like saying thank you is such a
Yeah.
reinforcer for them, or knowing that they had an impact. And so, positive reinforcement is really something that we leverage all the time with those around us as, basically as a way of adding something that is enjoyable to the learner that increases the frequency of a particular behavior happening again in the future. And again, I don't want to be overly technical about this because oftentimes when we're thinking about these human interactions, they're kind of happening on the fly. Again, we're not coming at it with this same sort of behavior change plan, but yet we can absolutely add consequences when we see or recognize behaviors that we like. And the tricky piece for me, at least when I think about positive reinforcement in sort of human interactions, is that I want to be sure that I'm not assuming what might be reinforcing to that individual.
Mm-hmm.
And this is something that I really struggle with, where I say, oh gosh, I love expressions of gratitude. So therefore, I'm going to say thank you to everybody that I
Oh,
meet for
yes.
every little thing. And people are like, oh my God, shut that guy up. That is super annoying. It's not a reinforcer for them. So, this is something where, identifying whether something is truly reinforcing or enjoyable is decided by the learner based on kind of how they respond to it. So I always have to decide if I truly want to be doing something that's meaningful. I either want to sort of be aware of what that individual is already gravitating towards in terms of their reinforcers, or I can even ask the question, hey, if I was going to thank you for doing something amazing for me, what could I do for you that would be really impactful or meaningful?
Mm-hmm.
Especially if I'm going to be in relationship with someone, whether that's a coworker or a family member, that's really great information to have. That generally speaking, these are the sorts of things that if I want to reinforce you for doing something amazing, it's more likely to fall into this particular category, or just understanding how they're likely to interpret it, I think is a really important detail.
Yeah. Yeah. And we're doing that with our canine learners as well, right? Like not assuming that, I use hot dogs for this dog. So then all dogs are going to love hot dogs, or all dogs are going to love tug. It's like, yeah, we're really looking at that individual. And I find that we often, especially with humans, it's like, I love, words of validation. So everybody, like, I'm going to offer that. And then I'm hoping everyone will give me that as a reinforcer. And it's like, it's not really how it works. Right. So yeah, being aware of that is really critical.
Yeah. Yeah.
The last ones, right? The differential reinforcement of alternative behaviors, step 5, extinction, negative reinforcement, negative punishment, positive punishment. We're not going to get too technical into those because we could really go down a weird rabbit hole, but I did want to just say that there is an inclination, or often a really fast desire, especially if we as humans are over thresholds,
Yes.
to lean towards punishment, right? And we see that in human interactions. We see that when stakes are high, like we see that in our world in general. And it's not like, this conversation is not to shame anyone that like grabs punishment as a tool with a loved one or a colleague or themselves even, right? It's just to bring some awareness to that and to invite folks to jump back up to, exit 1, exit 2, exit 3, and see if there's a way that you could modify your own behavior, or if you're working with someone else, that you've really gone down each step, right? So that we're not just jumping straight to positive punishment, which is like, that skill in within myself can be really fluent at times, especially if my wellness is not being considered, right? So if I go all the way back up to step number 1, if I'm over thresholds, or I've got A, B, and C going on for myself, then I might be really quick to react and use positive punishment on myself and others. And so just an invitation for folks to pay attention to their own behavior and to look at their behavior and like through this hierarchy when they're engaging with, again, their clients, loved ones, themselves, because it's applicable.
Yeah, it very much is. And and as you said, I love the fact that you let out by saying we're not here to shame, blame, judge. We're all human.
Yeah.
And under stress,
Mm-hmm.
it's so easy for us to sort of jump in as a correction, as a consequence of telling someone how wrong they are, or whatever the circumstances are, right? As a consequence for whatever it was that they did or said. And what we know from all of the studies that have been done on behavior change procedures, if the actual goal is behavior change, it's just not the way to get us there.
Yeah.
It's just not. And that's such an important thing, I think, for us to remember, is that it's not just about whether we're quote unquote being nice. It's actually, if we're even looking at this from a scientific lens of efficacy and what is most likely to lead to a behavior change that moves us in the direction we want to go, it's not the way to go.
Yeah.
It's just not. And it also takes practice, because most of us, myself included,
Mm-hmm.
didn't necessarily get an education in how to really, well, engage in some cases really difficult conversations with other individuals in a respectful, professional, effective way.
Yeah.
That's something that I'm learning now at this point in my mid to late 40s. I'm grateful that I'm learning a lot from colleagues and conversations like this one, and with others that we've been able to have, Marissa. But it's a process, right? And so
It
if
is a process.
you're new to the journey, awesome, welcome, and we'll do the best to meet each other where we are.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being here and for talking about this topic. And I know you have tons of other amazing webinars and podcasts, episodes, and whatnot. So where can listeners find you online?
The best place to find all of that information curated is on drpachel.com, drpachel.com. And if you navigate over to the media tab, you'll find links there for articles, for podcasts, for videos. Just start scrolling through there. Enjoy. And there's ways to contact me through that as well if you've got additional follow-up questions. I can't do consultations directly through that website. That requires me to do the work through the Animal Behavior Clinic here in Portland. But in terms of looking for additional resources, that's the treasure trove that you're looking for, if that's what you're looking for.
Awesome. Thank you so much, friend. Great having
Thank you,
this
Marissa.
conversation.
Yeah, thank you for having me on. Much appreciated.